So, the United States is threatening Canada over wildfire smoke, not asking for cooperation or offering to send help, but threatening Canada. A Michigan politician says Canada should manage its forests or risk becoming the 51st state. An Ohio senator wants sanctions against Canada and Canadian officials. And 4 members of Congress say that if Canada does not act, the U.S. will act on our own.
So, let me get this straight. Canada sends help when there's fires burning in the USA. A Canadian pilot died helping Colorado fight their fires. Then, smoke from Canadian fires moves south, and Washington decides that Canada needs to be punished.
Well, Mark Carney did not beat around the bush when he replied to those accusations. His answer was short and to the point. Climate change is everyone's responsibility, including the United States. He pointed to Canada's clean energy investments while driving home the point that the U.S. savagely continues to roll back its own.
And that one sentence put the entire American accusation on trial, because the United States wants Canadian help when it needs it, but when the wind changes direction, Washington wants a scapegoat.
Yep, it's just like the theater of the absurd south of the border there. 4 Republican members of Congress from Michigan sent Mark Carney an open letter demanding immediate action over the smoke. They said that their constituents were dealing with dangerous air quality, hospitals were treating children and older residents, and their patience had run out.
Then they went further. They said that Canada needed to manage its forests to prevent these fires. And if Canada refused, the United States would look elsewhere and act on our own to protect our people.
Now, listen to those words. They're not simply asking Canada to share information or expand cross-border firefighting cooperation.
It takes a crisis that crosses the border and turns it into permission for Washington to start giving orders. Michigan State Senator Eric Nesbitt told Canada to manage its forest or become the 51st state. While Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno said he would introduce a bill to sanction Canada and those responsible Canadian officials over the smoke.
Sanctions against Canada over wildfire smoke? Come on, you know what that sounds like? Sounds like a protection racket with a weather map to me. Hey, nice country you have there. Shame if something happened to it. Now fix the wind.
And John James called his message a final warning to Canada. What the heck is he talking about?
Listen, the smoke is real. The danger is real. But the threats, they're political theater. Something that the U.S. has become infected with during this Trump administration.
So let's talk about what happened for a second. Canadian wildfires sent smoke into parts of Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Indiana. People were told to limit outdoor activity. Vulnerable residents were warned to take precautions. Meanwhile, communities in northern Ontario were dealing with fires, evacuations, destroyed homes, and completely devastated communities.
Now, we're not glossing over fire prevention here. Canada has to take this seriously. And there are questions about forest management and questions about emergency planning. There are also questions about whether provincial governments are prepared for longer and more dangerous fire seasons. And those questions, they deserve answers, for sure, here in Canada.
But the American politicians skipped straight past the serious questions and went directly to blame. Canada caused the problem. Canada had the tools. Canada refused to act. America will intervene, not to help, to punish.
Yeah, and that is an absurd sequence, right? It leaves no room for climate conditions, no room for Canada's own communities, and no room for the American wildfire crisis. And no room for the fact that smoke, it doesn't stop at a border crossing. Come on, just learn something about physics, please.
Maybe those lawmakers should look at their own backyard before criticizing anyone else. The United States has its own fire crisis happening right now. More than 39,000 fires have burned over 3.67 million acres in the United States so far this year alone. And that's according to the National Interagency Fire Center.
So the United States is not standing outside this disaster looking in. It's inside the same fire season that's raging out of control in their own country. And that's the part that Washington wants to hide. You can't pretend the smoke is a Canadian export while treating American fires as a completely separate problem. The air is shared. The climate is shared. Heck, the continent is shared. Maybe a geography lesson is in order here for these people. Now, when reporters asked Mark Carney about the criticism, well, he didn't apologize for Canada. He didn't beg American politicians to calm down. And he didn't accept the idea that Canada alone should carry the blame.
Prime Minister Carney said, "Fighting climate change is the responsibility of all countries, including the United States." And that was the answer. There was no nervous explanation and no permission asked from Washington.
And then he pointed out the undeniable part. Canada is pursuing clean energy investment while the United States is actively rolling back parts of its own clean energy strategy.
Huge parts. So let me ask a question here. Who is the only Western nation in the entire world that has not signed on to the Paris Climate Accord? Who's the nation that is consistently rolling back environmental laws? Who's shutting down wind farms and solar projects? Well, it's not Canada, I can tell you that.
And that's where the accusation completely collapses on itself. The US is saying Canada must solve a continent-wide climate emergency alone. And Carney is saying, I think you need to look in the mirror.
Good for him. And he did it without turning the response into a speech about Canadian victimhood. He kept the focus on responsibility. Every country has to deal with the conditions making these fires more severe. Every country has to invest in prevention, and every country has to protect its people.
Including the United States. You aren't the world police that makes the rules for the planet. And that's the sentence that Bernie Moreno and the Michigan lawmakers clearly didn't want to hear, or just refused to admit.
Now, we want to get to the part that makes the American threats look even worse, if that's even possible. On July 12th, a 56-year-old Canadian helicopter pilot from British Columbia died when his aircraft crashed while he was helping fight fires in Colorado.
And then 4 days later, U.S. lawmakers were warning Canada that sanctions or even annexation could be on the table because smoke from Canadian fires had crossed into the United States. Man, that just makes my blood boil. Canada sends firefighters and pilots into Colorado to help American firefighters and sends help every single year. Then one of them dies doing that work. So when smoke moves north to south across the same continent, what do U.S. politicians do? Well, they decide that Canada deserves a final warning. And this has become a political conversation down in the U.S. They want Canada to behave like a partner and want our help when American communities need aircraft and crews. But when Canadian communities are battling their own fires, they want to behave like Canada is a delinquent tenant. That is a double standard, and it should make every single Canadian as furious as we are.
And I have seen Americans are furious as well, and I thank every one of you for your positive comments on the internet. It means so much to us when we see you showing compassion as your politicians show a complete lack of empathy.
Listen, Washington has a familiar problem whenever the consequences of its own decisions become uncomfortable. It needs someone else to blame. All of a sudden, the smoke becomes Canadian. The responsibility becomes Canadian. The solution becomes Canadian. And somehow, the United States gets to stand there as the injured party even while dealing with its own record-breaking fire season. And let's not forget the other motive here. Threats make great political content. They produce those headlines, they rally a domestic audience and the MAGA base, they make a politician look tough without requiring the politician to explain how the policy actually works. Canada becomes the target because it's easier to blame a neighbor than admit the entire continent is facing a worsening wildfire problem.
And Canada is an especially convenient target because Washington assumes that Canada will just absorb the insult like we always do. Well, that assumption is becoming dangerous because Canadians are angry, and Mark Carney is proving every day that those days are long over.
Here's what I know. The U.S. threats will produce the opposite of what Washington wants. They'll make Canadians more determined to control their own emergency planning, energy decisions, and national response. It will bring us together instead of tearing us apart.
And the fact is this: no U.S. politician has the right to dictate how Canada manages its forests, just like they have no right to dictate what happens when Greece or Spain or France is on fire, because everywhere is on fire due to climate change, which your government is denying.
Carney's response worked because he did not allow the United States to define the entire conversation. He didn't accept the accusation, and he didn't get trapped defending every Canadian policy decision. What he did was move the argument back to the one point Washington can't escape.
Climate change is everyone's responsibility, not just Canada's, not just Ontario's, not just the communities where the fire started. It's everyone's.
And if Washington wants to talk about responsibility, then Washington better look at what's happening in its own dumpster fire of a country first.
So now we want to hear from you. Are you as angry about the U.S. government's response and the likes of CNN and Fox News blaming Canada?
Let us know in the comments because we really want you to weigh in on this situation.
And make sure to share this with somebody who thinks that smoke stops at the border, because they need to hear this. They need a little bit of a wake-up call.
And remember to give this a like and a hype because it really helps us get the word out there to everyone.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.